Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty fundamental, a shift in how the U.S. Congress operates.
That's right. Specifically, the way partisan conflict has become, well, increasingly dominant in its actual functioning.
We're tracing how this developed over time and really changed the game in Congress, especially as we're seeing things play out now in April 2025, during President Trump's second term.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, to clarify what we mean by institutional polarization.
Right, because it's not just about, say, the widening ideological gap between Democrats and Republicans.
Or even how much they might dislike each other personally, although that's definitely related.
Our focus here is really on the institution itself, Congress. How it has changed.
Exactly. We're talking about its rules, both the formal ones and the informal norms of behavior.
How the legislative process works, or maybe doesn't work sometimes.
Right. And the power dynamics, within Congress, between the chambers, and also between Congress and the White House.
So in this deep dive, we want to unpack that. We'll start with a figure who comes up a lot in this story, Newt Gingrich.
Mm-hmm. His role, the strategies he used, and the consequences that flowed from that.
And then we'll look at how those trends didn't just disappear, but actually carried on, evolving through different presidents leading up to where we are now.
Under President Trump's second term, yeah. And ultimately, what all this means for Congress's ability to actually, govern effectively in 2025.
Okay, so let's start with Gingrich. Even before he became Speaker, what was distinctive about his approach? He was in the minority for a long time.
That's key. Even as a minority member, Gingrich was unusually focused on using national media. C-SPAN was fairly new then, and he really grasped its potential.
To talk over the heads of colleagues directly to the public.
Pretty much. His goal wasn't necessarily winning over Democrats on the floor in the traditional way. It was about building a national conservative movement and, frankly, framing the Democratic majority negatively.
So using Congress as more of a stage for national politics.
Exactly. Less a deliberative body, more a platform. And central to his strategy was framing politics itself as a kind of zero-sum battle.
Winner takes all.
Yeah. Partisan victory was the main goal. Policy details sometimes seemed secondary to just winning the fight and making the other side look bad, delegitimizing them, really.
And you mentioned the language he used was quite pointed.
Very. He often used stark, moralistic terms. Democrats weren't just wrong on policy. They were portrayed as, corrupt or somehow illegitimate rulers.
Strong words.
Definitely. It aimed to draw sharp contrasts, mobilize his supporters, and undermine the Democrats' public standing. That moralistic, delegitimizing language was a core part of it.
And he wasn't just doing this himself. He was encouraging others in his party.
Oh, absolutely. Through groups like the Conservative Opportunity Society, or COS, he pushed fellow Republicans, especially younger ones, to be much more confrontational.
Not just towards Democrats, but even moderates in their own party.
Yes. It was about building a more unified, aggressive Republican force in the House. That was laying the groundwork.
Which all seems to lead up to 1994 and the contract with America. How important was that contract?
Hugely important. Strategically, it was brilliant. It wasn't just a policy list. It nationalized the midterm elections in a way that hadn't really happened before.
So instead of 435 local races, it was one big national choice.
Kind of, yeah. Republican candidates everywhere ran on this single platform. It gave voters a very clear national contrast between the parties. That focus shift was key.
And it worked. Republicans took the House after decades in the minority. How did Gingrich read that victory?
He and his allies saw it as a massive validation, not just for the contracts policies, but for the whole confrontational, partisan style they'd used to get there.
Like proof that political warfare pays off.
That's how it seemed to be interpreted, yes. A mandate to govern differently, more aggressively.
So once he was Speaker, how did he change how the House actually worked on the inside?
He moved pretty quickly to consolidate power in the Speaker's office, a really significant shift.
How do you do that?
A key way was by weakening the traditional power centers, the standing committees and their chairs.
Weren't those committees where a lot of the detailed work and maybe bipartisan negotiation happened?
Historically, yes, they were hubs of expertise. But Gingrich often bypassed the seniority system for picking chairs.
Choosing loyalty over experience.
Often, yes. Someone aligned with his agenda might get the nod over a more senior member who wasn't seen as quite on board. He also used leadership-appointed task forces more often for big legislation.
Circumventing the regular committee process.
Right. It kept control tighter with the leadership. It ensured the party's priorities, as defined by him and his team, drove the agenda. Weakening those committees was fundamental.
And that changed the incentives for just a regular member of Congress.
Absolutely. If your path to influence or getting things done for your district runs more through the speaker's office than through building expertise and relationships in committee, your behavior changes.
You become more dependent on leadership.
Exactly. Less incentive to be an independent operator or build those cross-party ties that committees sometimes fostered.
And this centralization, did it enable specific tactics like the government shutdowns in 95 and 96?
It certainly facilitated them. Those shutdowns weren't just accidents of failed talks. They were quite deliberate strategic plays.
Using the budget process as leverage.
Yes, using the need to fund the government as a tool to try and force President Clinton to agree to Republican policy demands. It showed a willingness to prioritize partisan goals even over basic government functioning.
Did that normalize that kind of tactic?
I think it's fair to say it did. Fiscal brinkmanship became, well, a more accepted part of the political toolkit after that, a very high-stakes part.
Were there other procedural changes besides the shutdowns?
Yeah, under Gingrich, the majority made frequent use of restrictive rules for floor debate. Meaning rules that limited how many amendments could be offered, especially by the minority party, or how much time was allowed for debate.
So less opportunity for the minority to really shape or even just voice concerns about legislation.
Significantly less. It further concentrated control over what happened on the House floor with the majority leadership.
You mentioned the language earlier, the rhetoric. How did that play out inside Congress once he was Speaker?
That strategy of rhetorical demonization continued and, you could argue, intensified. He led by example, using harsh language.
And he encouraged others to do the same.
Yes. Groups like GeoPac, which he led, actually circulated memos advising Republicans to use specific negative words like betray, corrupt, decay, sick, traitors when talking about Democrats.
Wow. Just explicitly telling them to use those words.
Explicitly. The goal was clear. Paint the opposition not just as wrong, but as illegitimate, maybe even unpatriotic or morally flawed.
What does that do to the atmosphere, the working relationships?
It's incredibly corrosive. If you're constantly describing your colleagues across the aisle as enemies, as threats, then the basic requirements for legislating things like trust, mutual respect, assuming good faith, they just start to disintegrate.
The informal norms break down.
Exactly. Courtesy, reciprocity, the idea that I'll work with you today because I might need your help tomorrow, those things weakened. Personal relationships suffered. It really fueled what political scientists call effective polarization, that is, the personal dislike and distrust between members of opposing parties.
So it became personal, not just policy.
Very much so. And that lack of basic civility wasn't just about bad manners. It gummed up the works, making compromise and finding common ground much, much harder.
There's one more aspect. You mentioned Gingrich, shifting the focus of what it means to be a member of Congress.
Right. He really pushed the idea of the permanent campaign. He understood the media landscape and urged members to be constantly focused on messaging.
Media appearances, fundraising.
All of it. Constant communication, especially through friendly media outlets. The lines between governing and campaigning blurred, becoming almost one continuous activity.
So less emphasis on being a legislator, more on being a performer or a partisan warrior.
That's a good way to put it. Success started to be defined differently. Media hits, fundraising numbers, sharp partisan attacks. Those things became more valued, perhaps, than deep policy knowledge or the ability to craft a bipartisan deal.
It incentivized performance over deliberation.
Exactly. Members were rewarded for actions that got attention and fired up the base, rather than the often slow, quiet, behind-the-scenes work of legislating. It was a fundamental shift in the job description, you could say.
Looking back then, the cumulative effect seems enormous.
It really was. Gingrich didn't just change tactics. He helped redefine the perceived purpose of being in Congress, at least for many in his party.
From problem-solving institution to battlefield.
More towards the battlefield end of the spectrum, yes. A place to assert party dominance and defeat the enemy, rather than primarily a place for deliberation and finding common ground. And that shift has had really lasting effects.
So moving beyond Gingrich himself, what is that lasting legacy? How did it impact bipartisanship and norms in the longer run?
Well, the decline in bipartisan cooperation that accelerated in the 90s has largely continued. It's not that it never happens, but it's become much rarer on major issues.
We see more party line votes.
Far more. And things like bipartisan co-sponsorship of bills have generally decreased. Conference committees, too, those used to be really important for hashing out differences between House and Senate bills, often in a bipartisan way. They've become much less frequent.
And those informal norms we talked about, civility, reciprocity.
They've continued to erode. Reciprocity, that sense of give and take, has weakened. Respectful debate is, well, often absent in a media environment that rewards shouting matches.
What about defending Congress itself as an institution?
That's what's sometimes called institutional patriotism. And that seems to have declined, too. Members seem more likely to prioritize their party's advantage, even if it means weakening congressional powers relative to, say, the presidency, especially if the president is from their own party. Gingrich showed that challenging norms could be politically successful, and that lesson wasn't lost.
And we've seen this pattern continue under different speakers, different presidents.
Yes, the confrontational style became embedded. It wasn't just a Gingrich thing. Subsequent leaders in both parties have operated within and often contributed to this polarized environment. Hastert, Pelosi, Boner, Ryan, McCarthy, they all wrestled with it.
And what are the practical signs of this ongoing dysfunction?
We see several recurring patterns. The Senate filibuster, or just the threat of it, has gone from an exception to basically a routine requirement for a 60-vote supermajority on almost everything important.
Making it much harder to pass anything.
Much harder. Then there's the constant fiscal brinkmanship, threats of shutdowns, fights over the debt ceiling. These have become almost regular features, especially under divided government.
And the budget process itself.
Often breaks down. Instead of passing individual spending bills through committees, we get these huge last-minute omnibus packages, or just short-term continuing resolutions. Less scrutiny, less input from rank-and-file members, more power concentrated with leadership.
So overall legislative activity suffers. Gridlock.
Often, yes. Congress struggles to tackle big national problems, which feeds public frustration and the perception of gridlock.
And you mentioned this sort of tit-for-tat dynamic.
Exactly. Tactics pioneered by one party often get adopted by the other when the roles are reversed. Blocking nominations, using obscure procedural tools for delay, it escalates.
Almost like an arms race of obstruction.
That's not a bad analogy. The focus shifts from legislating to fighting to blocking the other side, no matter who's technically in charge.
We've also seen the rise of very ideological factions within the parties, like the Tea Party or the Freedom Caucus. How do they fit in?
They're a really important part of the story. While party leaders gained more tools to enforce discipline control over committee seats, fundraising, floor access, these factions emerged, especially on the Republican side.
And they prioritize ideology very highly.
Extremely highly. Compromise is often seen not as necessary, but as selling out principles. They've shown they're willing to obstruct legislation, even legislation favored by their own party's leadership, if it doesn't meet their ideological tests.
So they can act as a kind of internal check, or maybe roadblock.
Definitely a roadblock sometimes. In a narrowly divided House or Senate, a small group of determined members can have enormous leverage. They can effectively veto things, which makes leadership's job harder and bipartisan deals even more difficult.
And all this changes the underlying incentives for members, doesn't it?
Fundamentally, this might be the most important legacy. The whole incentive structure has shifted.
How so?
In today's environment, the rewards often seem greater for, say, landing a punch on cable news, having a clip go viral, or raising money from angry donors, than for doing the hard, unglamorous work of legislating.
What drives that? The media environment.
That's a big part of it. A fragmented partisan media often rewards conflict. Campaign finance is another, the rise of small-dollar online donors who are often very ideological.
And primary elections.
Huge factor. The fear of being primaried from the ideological flank pushes incumbents to toe the party line, avoid compromise, and signal purity to the base.
Plus, elections are more nationalized now.
Right. Members feel pressure to stick with the national party message, engage in the national fight, sometimes at the expense of local concerns or institutional duties.
It sounds like a feedback loop. Polarization rewards polarizing behavior, which causes more polarization.
That's exactly what it is. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Members feel compelled, for political survival, to act in ways that might damage the institution overall. Congress itself has sort of adapted to dysfunction, operating in this mode of near constant conflict.
Which brings us to today, April 2025. President Trump's second term. How is all this playing out right now?
Well, President Trump came back into office in January facing this already deeply polarized landscape. The election itself probably deepened those divisions, and public trust remains quite low.
So the stage was already set for conflict.
Absolutely. We're governing amidst intense partisan hostility within institutions that, as we've discussed, tend to amplify conflict rather than resolve it. President Trump is dealing with a Congress shaped by decades of this escalating warfare.
And given his own style, what are we seeing in terms of White House-Congress relations?
Predictably, a lot of confrontation. His approach often involves challenging norms, questioning oversight, favoring executive action. That naturally clashes with Congress's role, especially if the other party controls one or both chambers.
Can you give some examples of what that looks like in practice right now?
We're likely seeing a heavy reliance on executive orders and regulatory changes to push his agenda, trying to work around potential gridlock in Congress.
Oversight battles.
Intense ones, almost certainly. Fights over subpoenas, documents testimony, broad claims of executive privilege being asserted.
And the budget. Debt ceiling.
Renewed conflicts there seem almost inevitable, using those fiscal deadlines as leverage points, just as we've seen become normalized.
What about inside Congress? Filibusters holds.
Routine use of those tools. The filibuster in the Senate holds on nominations, restrictive rules in the House all being deployed to obstruct or gain leverage.
And investigation.
Likely highly partisan ones, launched by both sides, probably aimed more at scoring political points and generating bad press for the opposition than at serious fact-finding. The whole institutional setup enables these kinds of fights.
It's hard not to notice the echoes between Gingrich's playbook and President Trump's approach.
The parallels are striking, aren't they? You could argue that Trumpism is, in many ways, an intensification of the strategies Gingrich pioneered.
How so?
Both showed a real mastery of the media of their day. C-SPAN and talk radio for Gingrich, cable news and social media for Trump, using it to bypass gatekeepers and speak directly to the base.
Both prioritizing narrative and spectacle.
Yes, often over policy substance. Politics as performance. And both used rhetoric designed to delegitimize opponents, portraying them as fundamentally flawed or dangerous.
And a willingness to break norms.
Definitely. Challenging established rules and norms when they got in the way of political goals.
So did Gingrich, in a sense, pave the way?
I think that's a fair argument. He helped create the political environment and normalize the confrontational style that made Trump's rise possible. Trumpism built on that foundation, taking the permanent campaign, the focus on identity and conflict, even further.
With Congress often gridlocked, what does this mean for actually governing the country? What are the wider effects?
Well, as of now, April 2025, that gridlock continues to be a major feature. Passing significant legislation on big national problems is incredibly difficult. Even basic functions like funding the government smoothly are a struggle.
Success means stopping the other side.
Often, yes. It's defined negatively blocking the opposition rather than positively by enacting solutions.
And this gridlock pushes action elsewhere, to the states.
Increasingly, yes. When Washington can't act, states step into the void, but in a very polarized way.
How does that work?
States controlled by the party opposing the president might actively resist federal policies, pass conflicting laws, sue the administration. States aligned with the president might aggressively push policies mirroring his agenda,
Leading to a patchwork of laws across the country.
Exactly. On major issues, environment, abortion, voting, education, you see vastly different approaches depending on which party controls the state government. It reflects and deepens the national divide.
More fragmentation.
Yes, and while some might call it policy experimentation, it definitely increases national disunity and uncertainty. Federal dysfunction essentially exports the conflict to the states, reinforcing the polarization.
This sounds like it puts immense strain on the whole system.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
This level of institutional polarization in 2025 raises real concerns about the health of American democracy.
How so?
Congress's ability to act as a check on the executive branch is weakened when it's consumed by internal warfare and gridlock. Norms have eroded, procedures are weaponized. This institutional fragility contributes to and is worsened by low public trust.
When people see Congress as broken, they lose faith.
Right, and that cynicism can create openings for actors or movements that might not respect democratic processes.
Are there specific constitutional stress points that worry you right now?
Several. First, the weakening of checks and balances. A paralyzed Congress can't effectively oversee the executive. Second, the potential for crises triggered by things like debt ceiling standoffs, using essential procedures as bargaining chips.
And the failure to address big problems.
That's the third point. Persistent gridlock means major long-term challenges. Climate, debt, immigration, you name it, don't get effectively addressed, which further erodes confidence and can have severe consequences down the road.
And President Trump's style interacts with this.
Yes, it creates a kind of feedback loop. His norm-challenging approach can find purchase in a Congress already geared for conflict. Executive actions provoke partisan legislative responses using the very tools of obstruction we've discussed. Legislative dysfunction might then encourage more executive action. It's a destructive cycle.
Weakening the legislature and stressing the whole constitutional order.
Precisely. The polarization that started largely within Congress has now spread, undermining its core functions and raising broader stability concerns.
So wrapping this up, the story is one of institutional polarization being, in large part, engineered over time, with Gingrich playing a key role.
That's the core argument, yes. It wasn't just inevitable. Strategic choices, particularly Gingrich's focus on partisan warfare over traditional norms, fundamentally altered the institution.
And that legacy is very much alive in 2025.
Very much so. The gridlock, the executive-legislative fights, the performative politics, the weakened norms, the low trust, these are all connected to that transformation. Gingrich broke norms and created new pathways for conflict, and President Trump's style has flourished in that environment.
Which leads to the unavoidable question, can this be fixed? Can Congress rebuild its institutional integrity?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's incredibly challenging. The polarization is baked into the rules, the incentives, the political culture now.
People talk about reforms, filibuster, campaign finance, primaries.
Right, there are potential fixes. Changes to Senate rules, campaign finance reform, different primary systems, maybe leaders consciously trying to rebuild norms, strengthening committees again.
But getting agreement on any of that seems impossible right now.
It does. The very polarization that makes reform urgent also makes consensus on reforms nearly impossible to achieve. It would require a critical mass of people in both parties deciding that the health of the institution is more important than short-term partisan wins.
Which the current incentives don't really encourage.
Not usually, no. It might take a major crisis or a real shift in what the public demands from politicians to force that kind of change. But understanding how we got here, how this dysfunction was in part constructed, is maybe the essential first step towards figuring out a way forward.
A sobering thought indeed. Thank you. This has been a really insightful deep dive into how Congress got to where it is today. Lots to think about.
My pleasure. It's a crucial issue for the health of the Republic.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.